Let me move this microphone a bit closer. Yeah, that's it. All right. Well, last time we did the hair on Totoro. We did some of the textures as well. Last time we also encountered an issue. And that one was that if we make edits to the hairs now, we're going to fuck up the hair system, right? And that is one of the things that hair systems suck at. I use it for a lot of things, but if you want something procedural, if you want to change your hairs way later in the process, then this is gonna suck a lot, right? So if you're using it for example, still images like the one I made for Kitaro, that I did with particle systems like this, the hair system. I showed you how to do it, like we did this one. Then it works perfect. But if we want to animate this later, and if we see some things we need to tweak later on, then we're gonna encounter a bit of issues in the long run. And up until, well, a few versions ago in Blender, there was no real way to make hair in a different way. Until they actually introduced geometry nodes and the new hair system in Blender. Right, so it hasn't been out for that long, which means that, well, there's a lot to still experience and pretty much learn in that area as well. Means that the tutorials on YouTube are very, very limited. Stuff like that. You have to pretty much try and learn it yourself, which is always hard. So I'm gonna try to get you guys started with something new. All right, and to do this, I am actually going to select my Totoro, all of it. So draw your little box around it. If you don't have the box selected, remember you can cycle through the select options with W, right? You can just press W a few times until you see that little box on the top left. And you can just drag it around your Totoro. And I'm gonna hold shift and just double click on this image on the back because I don't actually want to duplicate that. And we're gonna duplicate entire Totoro, right? Shift D and X and just lock that to that axis. I added a lot of hair right before I actually duplicated this, so it's gonna be a little bit slow. And now we have two versions with hair. I'm gonna leave this left one just for the hair system, so we can later on just pretty much check back and forth which one looks better and which one is going to be more adjustable. All right, so we're just going to have a little bit of a playoff between the two methods. So for the right one, I'm going to select it. I'm just going to delete my particle system. Just click on that minus button. And then we have a naked Totoro back. And the left one, I'm just going to hide the hair system because it's taking a lot of system performance away. So I'm just going to hide that for now. And now we have two naked Totoros. Isn't that amazing? All right, so we don't really need this left one for now. So I'm just going to select that and I'm going to find it in my collection tab right there. And you can see that the thing that you have selected, even when it is part of, for example, the armature, so the bone structure, you can see that it is going to be like um, gray, gray highlighted there, which means that it's part of this object. So if you click the little arrow, you can just open that up and you'll see the actual thing that is selected. So you can, for example, just hide that and it's gone. You can do the same for the nails, right? If you select it all, you will see which items they are. So you can just hide that by clicking on that eyeball right there. It will be hidden. Beautiful. Right. Now I'm gonna select this right tutorial with the box selected. Just move that a little bit more to the left. Let's just place it left of this image, right? So later we have one on the right, one on the left. Now we got this base material set up, and the reason why it looks like this, even though we added like the texture and stuff, is because it is of course a hair principled BSDF node, right? If I swipe this to the left right there and change this to a shader editor, and I zoom in, you can see that this main node that will define the material is a principled hair BSDF. So if you ever see like this blocky triangle structure on your surface, then it will usually mean that you have a principled hair BSDF node that you don't use for any hair, but instead just for a mesh, right? So that's just something I wanted to say. We're not gonna be using this. So now we have to get started with geometry nodes. All right, and geometry nodes is quite advanced. And what you can do with it is very, very limitless. Which means that if I go to the editor type And that's the basic button we also use to go to the shader editor and stuff like that. So you click on that little drop down menu on the top left. You have an option that's called Geometry Node Editor. And if you click on that, you will get this screen. It will look pretty much like the shader editor, right? And it's going to work in the exact same way. We're going to be adding nodes. We're going to be connecting nodes. And if you don't know what nodes are, if I click on the new, for example, which creates a new geometry node group, we're going to be getting these nodes. So one of these things is called a node. And we got a group input and a group output, which basically means that we have a geometry input, which is the Totoro, and we have a group output, which is, well, the mesh that it has as the output. And right now it is directly connected, right, from input to output, which means that the output is the input. Exactly the same, which is the Totoro. All right, so this also means that we can do whatever we want in between here, and it will change the input and the output, right? For example, if we press Shift A, we have this huge list of things we can use to tweak our object. And I probably haven't used all of these. And that's because geometry nodes is very new still, right? So you can use it for very selective stuff. But one of the main things will be, for example, scaling up or down your object. For example, you can Shift A, search for a transform. All right, select that, and you can swipe it in between. And you can see that it connects to your input, and the other way is going to your output. And the main thing you have to keep in mind is that the little balls, the colors of those little balls, they have to match most of the times, right? So if it's green, it means that it's geometry, and then it will also connect to a green input, right? So a geometry input has to be connected to a geometry output as well. That is usually the case. There are some exceptions that we will also get into at some point. But now you will just have a node that controls the transformation of your object. Usually you do that with S, for example, in the viewport. You can scale your object, rotate with R, G to move it. And now you have three options, and this is basically a vector, right? A vector basically is a set of three inputs, and that is the x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis. So a vector contains the information for the coordinates of a point, pretty much, in your scene, right? And the translation basically just moves your object, rotation rotates, and the scale will just scale. And you can do this now in this geometry node as well, which means that translating this will just move it from the left to right. And I can just go to my solid view, and translation will move it from left to right, up or down. This is y direction, so back and forth. And Z is up and down, of course. Very basic, you already know this from different tutorials. And that is basically what your nodes allow you to do. So it changes the geometry. And you can scale this, for example. It will scale it up and down, just like that. And that is just all done in the geometry nodes. And that's just the start of it. We can do a lot of things with that. For example, if you want some rocks to appear on Totoro, and I'm just going to give you a weird example. I don't know why you will do that, but you can. You can, for example, use a node called instances on surface, I guess it's called. You can Shift A, search instance, and you have, let's see, where is it? No, we first need a distribute points, by the way. So Shift A, search for distribute points on faces. And that is basically a node that will just add random points on random places of your faces, right? So if I swap that in between, you can see that we will now just have random points on our Totoro surface, right? And that is what this node, for example, does. And that's also something we will be using later. And this has its own properties as well. Right, so we can set this to random, we can set this to poison disk, and the poison disk is something that you will be using. For example, if you're going to be adding rocks on a surface, for example on the ground, then if it's set to random, those rocks are going to be intersecting sometimes, right? There will be two rocks pretty much inside of each other. Poison disk, you can set the minimum distance that those rocks have between them, right? So I can increase this and there will be less points. And the same thing for the maximum. Stuff like that is something you can change. Now, each node has its own input, so to go through all of the nodes is going to be a lot of time. So I'm just gonna show the ones that you're gonna be using the most, but we will be getting into the hair system very soon. So now you have, for example, these points, right? And a good thing to know is that if you now distribute the points on, for example, your surface, you're going to lose your main object because the output of this geometry node, and you can see it, are the points alone. So the surface is gone. Right? If you want both of them, there's a very easy way to get it back. Shift A, search for a join geometry node. And you swipe it in between. And this section is now a place where you can swipe multiple inputs. For example, if I zoom out and grab that first geometry input, so of the group input, which is the Totoro, I can now add that to the join geometry node. And we will now see our Totoro and the points that we added. Alright, so that is very nice. Now, we can change, for example, the amount of points we have on our Totoro. If I have this set on random, for example, I can just increase the density. Poison Disc also has the density max vector. I can just swipe that up. And, for example, just increase the minimum distance. And that'll pretty much just get us a lot of points on Totoro. And if we want to add geometry on those points, there is one easy thing we can do, and that's what I mentioned before, is Shift A, and that is the instance on points. Alright, so this setup, the distribute points on faces, and the instance on points, is something you're going to be using a lot, and it's going to be used for scattering, for example, so the rocks on your surface can be used to scatter grass on your scene to create a large grass landscape, add flowers. What else? Well, you can add hairs, for example, in your head. You can add mushrooms to a tree. You can add leaves to the tree. It's all done with this system. So you need points and you need an object that goes on those points. So an instance. So if I now connect this in between of the distribute of points on faces and the output, the points disappear because we don't have the instance that's going to be distributed on the faces, right? On the points. And well, that is where your imagination comes in, right? The fun part now is that we can model any object. For example, let's just make a quick cube. Where is that? There it is. And I can now just inset this and extrude that. Right, buttons you already know. And this object we can now just use to instance on those points. Right, so if you go back to our Totoro and the geometry nodes, we now want that cube to be in the geometry nodes, right? We want it to be added. So what we can do is select our cube. I'm going to look for that in the object tree. It's called cube. So just make sure that you found it there. And now go back to your geometry nodes by selecting Totoro. You can now just drag your cube from that object tree right in your geometry nodes. And it will now basically be a new object info node, right? So this contains the data of your new object. And we can now just connect, remember, the green ball to the green ball. So the object geometry is going to be the instance. And it's now going to be scattering this instance to all of those points that we created. Right, so we can now just change the scale, for example, right here in those settings. And you can, and this is something that I'm not sure if I have shared that yet. If you hold left click on that top value and then drag your mouse down, you can see that we can select all of them at once and then just decrease the scale altogether. Right, so now, for example, it's going to be distributing that object, but just with some lower scales. Right, so that is just as easy as it is. And, well, you can see that, for example, the rotation and stuff is still off. You have a rotation input, a scale input. So you can also change the rotation to be in the normal direction of, for example, your Totoro. That's the last thing I will show, and then we'll get into that hair. The way to do that is with an rotate Euler to vector, and it sounds intimidating, and it is a little bit. But what it means is, if I select this little rotation ball and drag that to the left, and type in align Euler to vector, and just place that, you can see that your rotation is now going to be aligned to a specific direction, which in this case is X. You can also select Y or Z. It will change the direction, but we have a new input, right? We have a rotation and a vector. And what we can do now is we can get the normal information of those points, which means it's going to get the normal data of where those points are located. And remember, the normal is the direction that a face aims at, pretty much. And we can just connect the normals to the rotation. And then we can just rotate this around. And we need one more thing, actually. We also need, let's see, we also need a normal input node. So we now have the normal of those points. We can also add Shift A, search unusual normal. And this is all getting very complicated very fast already. And I regret that already. But you can pretty much connect that as well. And let's just change some information there. We should be able to get the normal direction at some point. All right, I'm just going to disband this because I'm going into way too much detail. We're here for hairs. Now, remember, we have geometry nodes. If you delete your geometry nodes, we're going to be deleting our geometry input as well because we have no more input, we have no more output, right? Which means that basically we are going to be deleting our information. We have no more output. Now, if you select your Totoro and go to your modifier tab, you now notice that we have a new modifier, and that's going to be the geometry nodes. All right, so you can just delete that, and then you have your original geometry back. All right. Well, for the new hair system, this is where things get tricky, but it's also going to get less complicated because we already explained the basics of geometry nodes. All right. Usually when you add hairs, you're going to go to the particle settings, hit that plus sign, swap that to hairs, right? Now, we're going to use a different method. But what you have to know at the start is that this does not work well with having your mirror still as a modifier. All right? So this is basically the point where we are going to be applying our mirror modifier. So just hover your mouse over it and press Ctrl A, and you can see a little pop-up issue with the shape keys that we added last time. If you still have your shape keys and you're getting this error, just go to your object data properties and just delete your shape keys real quick and go back to your subdivision, or sorry, to your modifier settings and Ctrl A that mirror. There we go. So now we actually have the information of the mesh for all of our geometry, right? And the reason why we need to do this is because the geometry nodes that we're going to be using, the hair system, it needs unwrapped UVs altogether, and the UVs cannot intersect. And if we only have one side of the mesh and we unwrap it, then the mirror of that mesh is going to have the same UVs, which means that multiple UVs will be at the same location, right? The original and the mirrored section. And that's going to give you some errors with the geometry nodes, right? So we need good UVs to get started with. Now, we still have the UVs from before the mirror, which means that we just have to unwrap this once again. And this is where the issue lies. And this is also where a beautiful next tip comes in. If we go to the rendered view, you can see that our texture is still fine. Even though we mirrored that, or sorry, even though we applied the mirror, our texture is fine. And that's because if we go to the UV editor and press tab in that left window, our UVs didn't change, right? Now, that also means that if we're now going to be working with geometry nodes, that it's still going to be working with those old UVs. So we still have to unwrap this into the new UVs. Now comes the trouble. If we unwrap this, you can see that it messes up our texture as well, which is annoying because we're not going to be drawing this all over again, right? We're not going to do that. So Ctrl Z that a few times. And this is the beauty. If you go to the Object Data Properties tab, there we go. There's a UV section that lets you add an additional UV, pretty much. So we can be using multiple UV maps. One, for example, for the texture, and the other one for the geometry nodes. And that is something that is incredibly useful, something that I've been using a lot lately as well. Having different UV maps is just incredible in Blender. So to make that work, we're just gonna hit that plus sign, and it will make a new UV map, and we can just double click that to rename it. For example, we can rename this one Geo UV. First one is going to be our default texture UV. So we can now just select our Geo UV and click that camera icon. And it's now still going to be the old UV because we pretty much duplicated it from the previous one. But now we can press tab, U, and unwrap all of it. And our texture is still going to be gone, but don't worry. It is stored in the first UV, because if we now click on that little camera icon in the first UV, it shows the texture with that initial UV. Right, so now we have two UV maps, one with the unwrapped UVs for geometry nodes, and one with the old UVs of that before mirroring. Right, so we have two things we can use. Now, how do we do that? I want to show my object with the Geo UVs, because that's what we're gonna be working with next. But I want to show the texture in the previous UV map. So we're gonna go to the shader editor, and we're gonna locate the place where we're actually gonna be working with UVs, and that's at the very front, right? So the texture coordinate and the mapping node, that's gonna be defining the placement of this texture of Totoro. So what we need to do is delete the texture coordinate, because that doesn't have the right UVs. Delete that. Now press Shift A, search for a UV map. There we go. And if you place that and just click on that little box here, it will show you the UV maps that your object has, right? So it has the GeoUVs and also the UV map. And we want the UV map, so the previous one we had, we want that to be used for the texture. So just select that one, and then connect your UV to the first vector input of that mapping node, and it will be using your old UVs, right? So even though we have the second one selected and shown here, it will still work with the old UV map. And that's just a little trick that comes in handy for a lot of stuff, and you'll find that out later as well. For now, this is looking quite nice, actually. What I'm gonna do though is change this principled hair BSDF. I'm gonna delete that. I'm gonna press Shift A and just change that for a principled BSDF. So not a principled hair BSDF, but just a principled BSDF. And then just connect the color and the BSDF to the surface. Right, so now we just have the, the texture and not that weird square triangle kind of a look on it. All right, now this looks fine for now. We're going to be working on those hairs now. So how do we get started with the new hair system, right? The previous one, the benefits were that we could groom it, right? We could groom the hairs, comb it in the direction we want. And the new one is actually still better, right? So we're going to achieve that by selecting our Totoro, hitting Shift A. We're going to go to curve, and there will be an option right there at the, what is it, like the sixth one. It's going to be called empty hair, and we're just going to select that. And that basically adds, and if I scroll up to my Totoro object, you can now see 3 of those hair strands and icon behind our Totoro, which means that it has an empty hair object, so the thing we just added. So if I open that up, you can see that we have some curves. We have curves on our Totoro, and it's going to be linked to our object. Now, how do we actually add hair? Because we don't see any hair now, right? So how do we add this? Well, with your curve selected, you can go from object mode to sculpt mode. And then we're going to be getting in the hair edit section, right? So we have all these settings back, which is basically just going to be the groom, so the comb brush. We can grow and shrink our hair, pinch it together, puff it up, smoothen it out. We can do a lot of things, add new hair, remove hair, stuff like that. And this actually has more settings than we had with the other hair system. For example, we now have a density brush, which is amazing. Basically, what it does it makes sure that at every location of our Totoro, we're going to be having the same density. Right? For example, if you have a distance minimum, which is going to be like the distance between each hair strand. If we set that to, for example, 0.03, and we're now just going to be drawing on a Totoro, it's going to be adding new hairs. And let me just go into my viewport shading. it's going to be adding new hairs in that density no matter the size of your brush, right? So I can make my brush smaller and it's still going to be adding the same density. I can make it bigger. It's going to be adding the same density still. And you can just increase this count max, for example, to 300 and it will just be adding more hairs more of the times, right? So you can just draw your entire Totoro in with the selected density. Fun thing is we can just lower this density value to, for example, 0.1, and it will actually be resetting the density to your new values, which is something that was incredibly difficult to do with the old system. Now we can just set this to any distance we want, any density we want, to just get this right. Beautiful. And we can change that whenever we want. That's the beauty. So we're going to set this to about 0.05. And then we're just going to get into this. And if you want this hair to be shorter, you can, for example, click on the curve shape on the top right there. And you can change your hair to, for example, a length of 0.1. And then you can just redraw it and it will be adding new hairs with that lower distance on it. All right. Okay, now that you know that, I'm going to control set this a few times. Let's see if we can get our Totoro nice and clean again. There we go. So now we can actually set the values that we want from the start, which is, by default, I want the length to be approximately the size I want it to be. Doesn't matter, but I like to have it at least somewhat near the length that I want it to be in. So 0.1 seems about right, I think. And we can make this longer if we want later. All right, so I'm just going to draw with that with a distance minimum of 0.05, and I'm just going to fill up my Totoro. All right, so just draw wherever you want. The density can't go above that level that you had it set on. All right, so we can just draw it in with a large brush. Make sure to cover all of the Totoro. Top, bottom, left, right. Whatever you want, we can do it. Right, beautiful. Now, for parts where you want more density, you can just zoom in, make your brush a little bit smaller, with F, by the way, and then you can change the distance minimum to, well, let's say 0.025. And then, for example, on this ears, I can just increase the density. Remember, at the previous particle settings we made, the previous hair system we did, those ears and the mouth area had some bald spots, right? And it was harder to control in that particle system. Right now, we can just increase the density there and just add more hairs wherever we need. Very easy. And we can just freehand this pretty much, because that's the fun part in this system. It uses the geometry nodes. And I just showed you that geometry nodes are incredibly adaptable. You can change it however you want. You can add stuff to it. You can remove stuff. And that means that it's way more procedural than your hair system that we made previously. So this way is just more controllable for the future, all right? Which is nice. Now I'm also gonna just increase the density on those hands a little bit more. Anywhere I need more hairs, I am just going to add a bunch more. Beautiful. Amazing. Also right here in the middle of the face. And you can already think about where you want the hairs to be shorter, for example, in your final model. Usually, for example, an animal has very short fur on the head, around the eyes and the nose, because you can't have it hanging in front of your eyes, of course. And the places where you want shorter hair, you most of the times also need more hair, because otherwise it's gonna just expose the skin. Now, in real life, of course, the animal usually has the same amount of hair on all parts of the body, I think. But in Blender, if you want as much hair on, for example, the belly as you have on the head, which is going to be way more, then your system is going to be very, very much in pain, which is not what you want. All right, so I think that will do for now. We can increase the density later. And don't worry about the eyes yet. We can just remove those hairs later. That's the fun here. We can just change it later without too many consequences. But I want to show you why we are using geometry. Right, I'm going to go back to object mode. We added some hair. It's nicely distributed on our surface. Right, so now I'm going to swipe this to the left. And I'm gonna select my hair, and we are going to go to the modifier properties, and you can see that we actually have a geometry nodes modifier on that hair. Which means that if we change this right window to the geometry node editor, we're going to be seeing some nodes. All right, we're going to be seeing a group input, a deform curves on surface, and a group output. And the way this works is, of course, this is going to be the input, which are the hairs. Then we have the deform curves on surface, which is going to include all of the edits we did in the sculpt mode of the hair. For example, we can groom this now, comb the hairs in a different direction, for example. And that is basically going to be all captured in this little deform curves on surface node. Right, so this makes sure that all of our edits are going to be used in our geometry nodes as well. Now, we have one error, which is invalid surface UVs on one curve, so I don't really care about that. Right, it's one curve. If one hair is missing, I couldn't care less. Right, so now we can do whatever we want in this geometry settings. Right, if I swipe these two to the left, I can add anything in between the curves, which are all of the hairs, and the group output. For example, we can make it more curly, more noisy. And usually when you want to add more noise or curves in the geometry node, you're going to be looking at a noise texture, which is something we've already been using in the shaders, in the textures. And the same thing is working here. Right, Shift A, search a noise texture. Right, now remember, we have green inputs and green outputs. But we have a gray output and a yellow output here. So we need something that can actually convert this noise texture to the green geometry input. Right, so we're going to be searching for Shift A, search. We're going to be searching for a set position node. And the set position is basically going to be a node that can change the position of the points of your curve. All right, so a curve is usually made out of different points, which is, for example, I'm just going to show you real quick, resample curve. So, for example, a resample curve node can change the amount of points that you have on your curve. For example, now we have 10, I can reduce this to 2, I can reduce this to 5. It doesn't matter, but your curve always consists of points, and these points are connected into the actual curve, right, into the hair. So that's something that you have to keep in mind. A set position will change the position of the points of this curve. Now, if I swipe this in between, just like that, nothing changes because we are not doing anything to the positions, anything to the offset vectors. Right? So blue is always a vector. Now we can, and this is an exception to the rule of just matching colors, a noise texture where is pretty much a black and white value. And that can be used for a blue input, for example. All right, because that is a vector, and a white and blue value is basically going to be 0 or 1. 0 being black, 1 being white. And 1, for example, means that we're going to be having 1 on each of the axes, right? So it's going to be 1 on X, on Y, and Z. And 0 will be, for example, 0, 0, 0 on all of the axes, so X, Y, and Z. So that is why you can use a value, so a single value for example, a vector that usually requires 3 inputs. It will just make all of those inputs, so all 3 of the axes, it will make it the same value. Which is why we can control that with a noise texture. So we can swipe the color into the offset, and right away you can see something happening to the hairs. It's gonna get curly, it's gonna get wavy, and it's gonna get chaotic as fuck. Right? So one of the things you notice is that the entire hair system is moving up and to the left for some reason. All right, and that is because a noise texture controls the offset, but it's basically going to be a vector, right? It's going to be a value converted to a vector, and the noise texture just likes to, for some reason, move our entire hair system away from the mesh, which is just something you're going to be having to deal with. But there's a very easy way to fix that, which is going to be with a vector math node. Shift A, search vector math. And I'm going to swipe that in between there. And vector math is very easy. It is just basic math, right? Add means we're gonna be adding something to our value. We have subtracting from the value, multiply, divide. You all know these values. I've never worked with the harder ones. I'm a fucking mathematician. I can't refractor. I don't know what that means even. I can't, I don't know, floor. I don't even know. I can do a sine and cosine, but I don't really know what the others mean. Usually I just play around with it sometimes. Things work. But by default, the top ones you're gonna be using, right? Add, subtract, multiply, divide, and scale is something you're gonna be using a lot. So for this one, we are going to be having to do some math to get this entire hair system back to the origin. And it's just a value that I think everyone knows now who works with geometry nodes. And it's going to be a subtract, and this is all going to be 0.5. All right, just remember that. When you work with a noise texture and you want to be controlling a scale, an offset, whatever, you usually just have to add a subtract vector math node in between and set the vector to set it to subtract and 0.5. And it will just move it all back to your original location. Right. So now you can basically change your noise texture to control your hairs, for example. Let's say you want the scale to be larger, you want more noise, you can just up that. Right? The same way it will work with your usual color texture as well. Right? You can decrease this. You can add distortion, which is basically going to be um, making your mesh more chaotic. So that is something that already works nicely. Now, there is an issue, and you may be able to see it if I zoom in. Right, the hairs are detaching from our Totoro mesh, and that is something that can't be happening. We want it to be always on the mesh, and we're not actually going to be moving the entire hair back, but we're just going to be moving those first points. Remember, I told you curves are made out of points. We just want that first point of the curve to be on the mesh. And there's a node that does that, and it's called Shift A, geometry proximity. There we go. And you all know what proximity means. It means it's just going to be checking what is closest to this object, right? And I want this object to be our Totoro model, right? So I'm going to select my Totoro, and we have a lot of Totoro models here because also the hands and the eyeballs and stuff, they're all called Totoro, I think. So I'm just going to rename our Totoro to OG, I guess, I don't know. And I'm going to select my hairs. And what I did with that cube earlier is what I'm going to do now. I'm going to drag the OG. Oh, I'm going to drag that OG. Come on. There we go. Drag that right in there. All right, so now we get the object info of our OG Totoro. So connect the geometry to the target, which is the input. And now we need to do something with that proximity node, all right? So right now it's checking what point is closest to our hair, which face is closest to our hair. All right, so if we want that to be snapping to each other, if we want the hair to snap to our Totoro, we need yet another set position node. Remember, set position is something we use to change the location of a point of the curve. And we want to change that first point of the curve to be on Totoro. So we need another set position node. Shift A, search set position. That's the wrong one. Set position, there we go. Swipe that in between. And before we use the offset, because we want to change the, the position of a point by a certain offset depending on this noise texture. But right now we just want to move the point, the first point of a curve, to the closest point it can find of the Totoro, which means we're just going to change the entire position of the first point of the curve. So connect that position to position. Beautiful. Now it's going to be placing each point of all curves to the closest point it can find of the Totoro. All right, so it's going to move your entire curve, your entire hair strand to the closest it can get to Totoro. And remember, we only want that first point of the curve, the starting point. And that is something we can do with the selection input. And the selection input will just tell this set position node what part of the curve it has to move to the selected location, right? And we can just drag this to the left. So select that selection point and just drag it out, and we can now just type stuff in there. And what we want to be using is endpoint selection. Endpoint selection node is something you use for curves, and it basically defines the point that's going to be selected from your curve. Start size is going to be 1. So the start size of 1 means it's just going to be selecting the starting point of your curve. And you can just change the end to 0. And that will mean it's only going to be selecting that starting point of your curve. Alright? And that is just pretty much it already, right? You can now see that each of our starting points of the curve are nicely attached to Totoro, and the rest of the curve does whatever the hell it wants. And that is beautiful. That is just what we need. We can now change whatever we want of those curves, and the starting point will always stay attached to Totoro. Beautiful. Alright, let's see how we're doing on time. I'm going at this for quite some time. Alright, I'll just cut it up then. Let's see, is there anything else that I want to show for now? Maybe I can show you something fun that we can do with geometry nodes. Alright, for example, this is just hair, right? This is just hair, it's just a hair strand. In the next tutorial, we're going to be tweaking this until we actually get the hair we want. But for example, you can use curves for a lot of different stuff as well. Let me give you an example. Alright, I'm going to just think of some stuff on the spot, which is always fun. For example, I'm going to press Shift A, and I'm going to search for an instance on points, right? I said that before to you guys. This is basically going to instance an object on the points we select, pretty much. Right, we did that previously with the rock and the points on Totoro. But now we're going to be doing that with only the endpoints of these curves. For example, if you want to make mushrooms on Totoro, I don't know, could be fun, some The Last of Us stuff. And then we could, for example, make the hair strand we have now, this curve, we could make that like the foundation shape of the mushroom. And then we could add like the mushroom head on top of that on the end of these curves. The way we can do that, for example, and I know you like the sound of that, I'm just gonna do it. We can, for example, use this set position. This is all the details, all the information for all the points of all the curves. So I can connect that to the points. Right, so now we get points on all of the points, which is going to be a lot of points, don't get me wrong. And we're gonna be selecting the ones we want now. Alright, so this one, once again, has the selection input. And I can drag this to the left. And once again, I can use an endpoint selection. Because I only want those mushroom heads to, for example, be located on the endpoints of these curves. Right, on all the endpoints, I want a mushroom head, for example. Which means that we now have to drag the starting size to 0 and leave the end size at 1. And if I now drag these instance points in the geometry, it's gonna be gone. Damn it. Alright, we first have to add an instance, I guess. So we'll be doing that first. So I'm gonna press Shift A and search for a join geometry node. Drag that in between there. Just so we can combine the curves with the instance right there. So now we should be able to see both later on. And now we can basically just set the instance that we want to be using. Alright, so if I drag this to the left and search for example, a cube, so mesh cube, it's going to add a cube on all of these points we have, and it's going to be incredibly huge. I'm going to lower the size of the cube a little bit, so we just see the cube point. And you can see that we now have only cubes on those endpoints of the curve. Alright, and you can see where I'm going with this. We can now just change that cube to our own object, for example. Let's just make a very quick mushroom head. I'm going to add a circle, set the vertices to 8 on the bottom left there. And I'm just going to move this to the left a little bit. And I'm going to press tab. I'm going to press A. I'm going to press E. Escape. First go to edge select mode by pressing 2. And then press E and just move that up. Press Z to lock that to the Z axis, remember. And I'm just going to scale that up a little bit. I'm going to extrude that Z, E, Z. Just make something like a mushroom shape. I can't even remember how it looks. I think we have to double click on this edge to select the edge loop, scale that down. Press E and Z and S, scale that in a little bit. And then E and S and G and Z. Just move that up a little bit more. I think if we now press F, it will fill it up. I think this is basically a low poly mushroom head, if I remember it correctly. And because we're gonna be replacing each of these cubes with one of this mushroom head, we have to make sure that we don't add too much geometry to this mesh, right? There's a reason why I'm making it poly. It's because we're gonna be replacing each of these cubes with one of those. Right, so the higher resolution you make your object, the more system you are going to be using, the more resources. So select your mushroom, press F2 to change the name, and just name that mushroom head, something like that. Find it in your object tree. If you do, just click on your object, so the hairs. Let's get this window back. And we can now drag that mushroom head back in there. And we can now connect that mushroom head geometry to the instance instead of the cube. Now delete your cube. And now we have our mushroom head instance. Okay, now remember I showed you the transform node. So Shift A, search for transform, swipe that in between. And we can now just change the scale of this object to whatever we want. Something small, something big, doesn't really matter. Let's go with that. All right, so they're all going to be very tiny little mushrooms, but they are all going to be looking up, right? They're all rotated upwards. If you want this to be rotated on the curve, right? If you want it to be tangent on the curve, we can add some very easy nodes, and I showed you this before as well. We can, for example, drag this rotation out and add an align Euler to vector. And that is just a node you're going to be using a lot when you're going to be changing vectors, or sorry, changing rotations. And we can now just add, for example, and that's not an example, this is something you have to do. Press Shift A, search for a curve tangent. And a curve tangent is the information of the rotation of a curve, right? For example, in this point right here, there, the tangent is pretty much going to be like perpendicular on the direction. Oh, that's not the direction at all. On the direction, this is direction. It's going to be tangent on the direction. So it's going to be like this is what we want for the mushroom head pretty much. Right? So we need the curve tangent to pretty much tell us how that head has to be rotated on the curve. And that is exactly what we're going to be doing by just swiping that into the vector of the align order to vector node. So connect that there. And now just make sure that you have the correct value. So you can change this from X to Y or Z. And Z is actually the one we need. You can see right here. Our mushroom head is placed nicely on the direction of the curve. We can change the origin of the mushroom head if we want it to place it deeper. Right now the origin is there, and that's going to be the point where it's going to be placed on the curve. So if we want the origin to be right there at the base, we can select it, Shift S cursor to select it, tab, right mouse, set origin to 3D cursor. There we go. And then it's going to be changing the origin points there, and now it's going to be beautifully placed on top of these hairs, as you can see. All right, so this is now the mushroom head, and this thin hair is something we could potentially just swap in for a mushroom stem by adding some very easy thickness. One way to do that, I'm just going to show you a quick way and call this a day. I can extend geometry nodes tutorials forever because it's a lot of fun. We can, for example, Shift A, search, set curve radius. And that is going to be defining the radius, so the actual, the radius of one of those curves, for example. So we can set this to very small just to start off with. And then we can press Shift A, search for a curve to mesh. Right? And that's just something you need to add in order to change your curve into an actual object with geometry, with thickness. All right, so it changed it to pretty much a black shape because we don't have any profile curve, right? And the profile curve is just going to mean it's going to define what the shape of your curve is going to be. All right, so we can swap that to the left. And actually, before we do that, we're not going to connect it yet. We're going to press Shift A and search for a curved circle. There we go. Now, the curved circle is very, very big. It has a radius of 1 meter, which means that the dimension, the radius of one of these mushroom strands, is going to be 1 meter, which is, of course, incredibly large. So we're going to change that to something much smaller. And we're going to change the resolution to like 5 as well. Right? We don't want a lot of geometry for this because it's very small. So just connect that curve to the profile curve. There we go. And it's going to be disappearing. And I think that is because we have a very, very low geometry now. So we have a very small radius. So crank that up by just moving it up like this. Right, so now we can see that we're actually getting some thick mushroom strands right here. That just define the base of the mushroom. Now it's also possible, and I'm going to do that in the next tutorial, I guess. Then we're going to be actually defining the thickness of those curves. For example, we want it to be smaller at the head and thicker at the base where it starts. We can all do that. And the fun part now is that if we go back to that noise texture, for example, and this is where you're going to real power of geometry nodes, is if we change this noise texture, you can see that it's going to change the mushrooms, the shape of the mushrooms, the direction of the mushroom head, so where is it aiming at. It's going to change pretty much everything. All right, and that's the fun part. You can change this to 4D, which means you can actually move your noise texture and you can animate it, for example. All right, you can make everything move on Totoro, so you can see that it looks like the mesh is moving even though you're just moving mushrooms from place to place, which is, in my opinion, a lot of fun to play with. So that is just the beauty of it. Now, as a final thing, I will show you the beauty of this new hair system. We're not even making hairs yet, but we can select it, and now we can still go back to sculpt mode, and we can change those hairs. It's fucking crazy. We can just, for example, we can lower the density if we want. For example, if we want to be less there, we can just lower the density now. Like that. You can also increase it on some parts, for example, let's say the head again. If we want more there, you can just add more mushrooms on the head. You can comb the mushrooms to give them a certain direction. For example, the fun part now is the snake hook. That was never there in the old hair system. If I select this and I just drag this out, I can just make long strands of mushrooms. Moving up, moving out, moving anywhere. We can just entirely enclose our Totoro in mushrooms, for example. Another fun thing, pinch. If we do that, it's gonna be moving all of those mushrooms closer together, for example. Puff is going to do the entire opposite thing. It's gonna be moving them more outwards. Alright, so that is the fun in this system. We can tweak whatever we want. We can add whatever we want. We can make things longer. We can just drag stuff out here. And now if I go back to the noise texture, we can still control all of those mushrooms. It's still going to be controlling everything. And that is the fun part. It's all procedural, right? And it's all live view as well. It's all changing in front of our eyes. And you can very easily just add more resolution to your curves by, for example, just increasing the count of this resample curve. Right? If I increase this, you can see we're getting more geometry, more detail, more detail, more detail. Right? That's the fun part. And if we want these curves to be as smooth as we can make them, we can just add a set of two nodes. And oh my god, I'm still dragging this out. All right, last thing, I promise. Shift A, we can add a spline type, set spline type. That's gonna define what kind of curve we have, right? Right now, it's very blocky, very hard. If you want this to be very smooth, we can set this to Bezier, and we can hit Shift A and search for a set handle type and swipe that in, and it's gonna make everything very nice and very smooth. And that's looking way, way better already. Now we can change this noise texture scale. It's gonna be a little bit slower because it needs more geometry to smoothen everything out, of course. And we can see that we have a lot of control over all of those mushrooms we just created. All right, that's just where I'm gonna be finishing this. I'm not sure um, how we cut hair from hairs, but I don't mind. This is a lot of fun to just show you guys. And now you can see we have a Totoro with a mushroom disease. Isn't that fun? All right, I'm gonna end it right there. Otherwise, I'm gonna be spending too much time. Hmm? Yeah, it looks like it had a lot of parasites.
Yeah, it really does look like the Last of Us zombies.
Yeah, yeah, it really does. Yeah, no, it's just the fun of geometry nodes. This is only like the basics as well, so you can do a lot in geometry nodes. And at some point, we'll dive deeper in that. I hope it was even followable because there is a lot of information to get into at the same time. Um, but I'd love to see you guys make something with the stuff that I showed in this tutorial. But don't make it mushrooms, but for example, something else that you have in mind. Ah, yes. Yeah, I dragged this out a little bit. But the next one, I think we're just gonna take a step back and go back to the making the hairs instead of mushrooms, which is why we started this thing at the first place. But no, it's geometry nodes. It's the future of Blender. Believe me, it is what people are starting to use more and more to create insane structures. People are using geometry nodes to make procedural roads, for example. So you can draw with your mouse just a random shape. It will add a road, it will add the light posts, it will add houses on the sides, it will even add grass, tiny details, a river on the side, stuff like that. It's all exactly. Let me show if people who haven't seen it. Yeah, it is. Let me show you that actually. Yeah, there it is. The braids. That's exactly what I'm talking about. You can just draw, for example, and it will add a new braid on that location with like a little ribbon on the side. I even have this little switch button. Where the fuck is this? A little bit longer geometry notes. You can just switch this on, and it will turn it to actual hair, for example, right? Give me a sec. Changing to hair. All right. So it turns the actual strands into hairs and stuff as well. And this is the entire node setup that I made for that, which is a lot longer than what we have now. But once you get into it, I promise it's a lot of fun to work with. Thank you. Yeah, no, next tutorial we will get back to hairs and give Totoro some nice hairs. And the fun part is that if you're actually gonna be animating Totoro, like we have an armature, we have a bone structure and stuff like that, you can, for example, turn the hairs into whatever you need during the animations. Well, you can swap them out, transform them, make them longer at places where you need them to be longer. You can animate whatever you want in like the node setup. You can animate all these values, right? Everything you can change, you can animate as well. So just imagine the possibilities with that. Well, that was it. It was a little bit longer than usual. I hope you guys don't mind. I thank you all for sticking through that one. It was a long sit and not the easiest one as well. So if you're still here, thank you for watching. Um, I will probably be going to play some Fortnite. Who's joining me?
I have to go to work, but I wish I could play some Fortnite.
That sounds like an excuse to me. Put them on hold and play a game. Be like, hello, this is Liquid. Please hold. Don't mute it, and then just be like, fuck, got a guy behind you. They'll take the message real fast.
Oh man.
No, that's fine.
But if you're still playing in 9 hours, I'll come join.
I don't think so. No, it's all right. I'll see whoever is there. I'll just